Let's get more into transitions and organizational nuts and bolts. And some of this you may be on the front end of, depending if you're one of those. I know there are several parishes where the recommendation is to link and then to merge, a year or two down the road. Some of these transition things I think will be helpful for you to think about. So we're going to talk about change strategies, phasing, key variables, and evaluation. Again, there's no silver bullet. Every community is so unique. There are some basic principles and ideas that I can give you, but you've really got to be in dialogue with the people. Somebody, during one of the breaks came up to me and said, "Do you think it would be a good idea if the pastors got together?" And I said, well, yes and no. Because one of the things I've seen sometimes is the pastors gathering, making decisions, over a drink or whatever, or on the golf course, however, and then it makes a sham of engaging the many lay gifts and talents in the parishes. Okay, so yes, I think it is a good idea for the pastors to gather, to build some relationship, to build some trust, but they need to be very careful that they don't preempt the work of the cohort or the shared council committee. So if it's a balanced approach, yes, it can be helpful. If it undermines the integrity of engaging all the gifts, remember my definition of collaboration is the identification, the release, and union of the gifts for the mission. And you don't want to torpedo that, because if anything, you take the church backwards instead of forwards. So, basic strategy. Here's a question for you. Is it better to bite the bullet, make the changes and get it over with? Or to take small steps over time and make the changes needed? Anybody? Bite the bullet? Both?
I think it depends on your community too.
You get the 2 points. That's the right answer. That's the right answer. It depends on the community. I have had parish communities, and what you need to do is gather and ask the people and the leadership. Form that inter-parish team, community, cohort, council committee, I'm not sure what labels. You may find when they get together, they say, hey, if we're going to be merged, in 2 years, let's do it and get it over with. Others are going to say, well, I need some time. I know there's this exercise of the settlers and the pioneers. Has the group done that? No, okay. All of us handle change a little differently. Some of us are pioneers. We love change and we can't wait to see what's out there. Okay? Some of us are settlers. We like to find our place, build our cabin, sit in front of the fire, and let life be. And some of us are in between. Now, just for fun, let's find out where you are. So, on a scale of 1 to 5, in a second I'm going to ask you all to hold up a number of fingers. If you're a 5, you are one of those pioneers. Change energizes you, you look forward to it. If you're a settler, you're a number 1. And if you're kind of in between, you're a 3, playing it safe, hedging your bets both ways. And you can be a 2 or a 4 also. So on a count of 3, hold up a hand as to how many fingers are you, and then just look around the room at the diversity here, okay? So 1, 2, 3. Okay, we got lots of 3s, a lot of playing it safe, but we got some 5s, 4s, all right? And we have some 2s, all right? There's a couple of 2s. Nobody wants to be branded a 1 or they don't have their hand up. I understand. A 0. Okay. All right, we got a 0. Okay, but now realize that in your faith communities, you have the same diversity. You know, and part of your task as pastoral leader is to help discern, and I use that word advisedly, what is the level of change the community is capable of and in what period of time. Now, if everybody's a 0, you've got a lot of work because you still have to move forward. You know, staying put, you know, it's kind of like the Albert Einstein. Using the same thinking that we've used for years is not going to get us into the future. You know, we've got to rethink how we do church and how we share our gifts and talents between communities and within the parishes themselves. So this whole question of, is it better to get it done with? I have had communities that have gathered, and that's the spirit of the leadership. We've seen this coming for years. Let's quit talking about it. Let's get it done. And others are going to say, well, the plan says that we can take 2 years. I think we should take every minute. And that's okay, as long as they're on the journey and moving. Is that good? Okay. I'm just checking here with...
I think it's important to know you're saying that people in the community are in all different places.
Correct.
Even if your community is predominantly a 4 or a 5 on that scale, there are still those people who are 0s, 1, and 2s, and it's your responsibility to be prudent enough to bring them along. You don't want to leave people behind because we have a group of people who are saying, yeah, let's go. You know, I think there has to be responsibility exercised
Right.
here in leadership.
Right, and that's part of that discernment. You know, I just give you a quick tool that I like to use in parishes in terms of discernment. You know, you don't have to do, you know, a big expensive survey or big town hall meetings, whatever. One of the best techniques that I use often with a community just to test the pulse is what I call the 4x6 card strategy. After communion, you have a pile of 4x6 cards in the ends of the pews. And, you know, somebody, either pastor or member of the planning committee, comes forward and says, as you're aware, you know, we have been invited to form a linkage with, you know, the next parish. We're part of the planning committee. We would like to get your wisdom and your advice. As we begin this planning process, everybody take a 4x6 card, just write down one sentence. What advice do you have for us as leaders? You're not voting. You don't want to ask a yes or no question, but it's, what advice do you have? And very quickly, you're going to get this pile of cards, and it doesn't take long. Zipping through them, you will have a sense of where the landmines are, what are the concerns, what level of interest support, so that as you create your plan, you can incorporate the wisdom of the parish. Yeah, doesn't cost much, can be very, very effective in giving you an idea. When you have a specific proposal, you can do the same thing. You know, put the proposal and say, next Sunday we're going to ask for your wisdom. You know, you invite them to not try to write a book on a 4x6 card and to use their best penmanship so you can read it. But it's a very easy way to constantly monitor. And then when you get those cards, have somebody plow through them and at least give a brief summary. This is what we heard you say. These were the dominant themes. You don't do percentages or any of that sort of thing, but you let people know they've been heard. It is critical. But then they're part of the process in creating the plan without a lot of work. My own bias is the intentional phases over time. That I find the most successful, to take continual steps in faith. You know what the outcome is going to be. Let's take a step. Let's build some success, some pride, some of those relationships, and let things unfold. So let me give you some ideas of practical phases. And again, many of these will apply to linkages. They could also apply to consolidations. They could also apply to greater collaboration at the cohort level, depending how far you are able and the Spirit's moving. So first one would be each parish stays separate. And you just find one or two projects that you can agree on. Phase 2 is we centralize some things. One of the most common that I hear is the confirmation program. Because everybody has, a program and could use some help. And there aren't enough kids and teachers and mission activities, but coming together, and that tends to be one. There are some adult faith formation programs, speaker sorts of things. Although I find in general, when one parish brings in a speaker, it doesn't necessarily mean the other parish will come over. I think you need to do some other kinds of activities that cross those. And then, of course, the last phase is all centralized all together. So this is the general framework. How does that play out? Pastoral councils, okay, or cohort councils. Phase 1 is you maintain all the existing ones, but they meet at the same time and at the same place. And the first part of the evening is common prayer and announcements, calendar coordinating. St. Mary's has their fish fry coming up, and you know how good that is, so love to have you join us. But you share those, and then you split to 3 different corners or 2 different corners of the school building. Instead of the pastor having 3 nights of parish council meetings, he has 1 because he rotates. Stops in here and there. Pastoral council knows it can't make a decision of any significance until the pastor has a chance to plug in, but they have plenty of time to discuss the pros and cons and can provide their reasoned rationale for a recommendation, and it saves the pastor sanity. The other thing is that he can plug in and say, St. George's is talking about the same thing. Why don't we get together? Some parishes I know that use this model, they'll have the meeting together. They'll take like 45 minutes to handle first agenda. Then they all take a break at the same time. Why do they take the break at the same time? To get them to interact and hear what the other parish is working on. And then they come back to their home base council and say, hey, they're talking about this neat mission outreach project. I think that's something we should support, or we should get involved in, or maybe we could co-sponsor. What a radical thought. Okay? But it's a way of beginning. So the phase 2 is to form an inter-parish council, or cohort council. In this model, the pastoral council meets on the 1st, 3rd, 5th months of the year, and the inter-council meets on the 2nd, 4th, and 6th. So you have the back and forth. Each parish still maintains its identity, its sense of who it is, and its responsibility for their unique parish. But then representatives, and not always the same people, are part of the inter-council. Again, you don't multiply the meetings of the pastor, but you space them out, and you use this as a bridge to forming one. Now, when you get to the one, I think you still need to have the St. Mary's Society. Even though they have reps, There are certain functions that give each parish an identity. Certain things in terms of buildings and grounds, that are important to that local community. But then you organize a society, not a full-blown parish council, finance council, whatever. And it's a way of phasing into greater cooperation, collaboration. Okay? Finance council. Now here we have some issues with canon law, in that every parish by canon law must have a finance council. Different dioceses, and my own, have played with some interesting models. Phase 1 is you maintain the separate councils. Phase 2 is you at least, phase 1, and you can also look at consolidating bookkeeping and an envelope return system. So envelope return system is each parish in the linkage or cluster has a different colored envelope. Whatever church you go to, you are guaranteed that that envelope will make it back to your church of origin. Okay, so it's a way of giving people, the loose change stays with the church. It always comes up, but okay. But it's a good, to centralize your bookkeeping. I'm working with 4 parishes right now, and they were looking at hiring a full-time bookkeeper for 4 parishes. And it would have cost them, I don't know, $40,000, $50,000 with benefits, or at least. We found a local bookkeeping firm that will take care of all the bookkeeping, give them much more reliable records, stay on top of the tax laws for about $12,000. Okay, outsourcing certain business functions. Now, again, that can be done and still maintain separate councils. But and we were finding, especially with some of our small town rural parishes, there's no way they can stay on top of the tax laws and with the regular change of staff, get the reports in. And so we were getting parishes with IRS penalties because they weren't filing the right paperwork. Again, core staff salaries programs can be shared via a formula. When you get to, and it's fairly common, everybody has a need to engage more youth and young adults in their parish. And so, again, a fairly common thing is, can we share a youth minister if there aren't already in the system? Well, the question comes up, well, how do you fairly share the salary? Well, we've put together a formula, and feel free to use it. We look at mass attendance, because that's an objective number. We look at, in our diocese, we maintain what we call contributing units. Do you have that? No, okay. In our diocese, any household that contributes $100 or more is considered a contributing unit. Because we have registered households, and that's always a fuzzy number. Because there are some parishes who say, well, if we don't hear from you in 18 months, you're history. And others who say, we're never going to drop anyone because we have that opportunity for evangelization via our mailing list. So registered households is a fuzzy number because none of the parishes treat it consistently. So we use contributing units. And then the last one is sacramental need. We have objective numbers on weddings, baptisms, and funerals. And basically, we would create a formula. So the larger parishes pay a higher percentage than the smaller parishes in a cluster cohort. And it's done objectively and fairly. And it can be reevaluated every 2 to 3 years to make sure that it's still a fair, just system to use. Yes?
Just so you know, in our diocese, there's also an agreement form that's put in place between the pastors of the separate parishes or on behalf of the parishes that are entering in under the same pastor, and an agreement between the employee and that local parish.
Okay.
So there's a worksheet that was shared with the pastors at a pastor seminar that we can pass on if you need to do it. So there is some structure around this
Okay.
for personnel.
Great. Great. Phase 2 is an inter-parish finance council. Well, now how does this work if you have to have separate councils? Well, it's basically a meeting of separate councils that are still separate, but meet together, maybe on a quarterly basis, maybe twice a year, to look at how they share things. And of course, and they oversee that core budget. They'll develop those formulas. They support the local finance councils. And phase 3 is one, but basically that's a merger, okay, where you have one. But again, this shows a progression that some parishes may go through over several years. What about one office? First phase, is pastor and court team dispersed. Pastors at Parish A, pastoral associates at Parish B, the deacons at Parish C, and they each have at least a part-time secretary. They do have some common staff meetings, etc. We find that the symbol of having an open parish office is critical to a parish in terms of its self-identity and its belief in having a future. Even if it's only half a day, but to have their own office, somebody who can answer the phone, greet, take care of mass attendance, give the basic information. Phase 2 is the pastor and court are together in one office. Now, this is the preferred model, certainly, of pastors, and to help foster that sense of team in service. Remember, I told you the story of Father Gary with his 6 parishes? That was part of the model. They were all at one place. So his ability to monitor, support, supervise, for them to gather and collaborate, it was critical to have them all in one spot. Now, one of the things, especially when you have the linkage, is if you have the staff at one office, then there's this image that, oh, that's the one that has a future. And so what we recommend is the office be at Parish A, but the pastor live at Parish B. Then each has an important symbol as they look to their future, if indeed the future is intended to be a linkage. And that works very well, especially because, believe it or not, there are a few of our pastors who don't like living over the store. And so this gives them some space, which I think is healthy and very, very well. Maintain some of those parish offices with at least part-time secretaries or volunteer staff in some instances. Phase 3 is one office, one site. But again, this is something you might migrate to over a 3 to 5 year period. It isn't something that goes fast. Reduced mass schedules. The thing is the goal to make the Eucharist available to the largest number of people. That's part of our intention. And we want people to be able to experience the Eucharist. And so that's the first principle that I put out when we start this discussion, when we have a linkage, a consolidation, cohorts coordinating mass schedules. So that means the church that has the largest worship site, this is where you use the facilities as best you can. They don't get carte blanche, but they at least get the key mass or two, so that you can serve them. Second principle is each parish should at least have one mass. We have several of our parishes where the only mass they have is a Saturday night. They tend to be the smaller ones in a cluster. And with, again, our fewer priests, that's all we can possibly provide. Principle 3 is the rule of thirds. And I don't have hard data on this, but I find that when you change mass times, the rule of thirds goes like this. 1/3 of the community will attend Mass at their parish of origin no matter what time it is. You know, they've got St. Mark's in their blood and bones, and they are going to be there. 1/3 will attend based on their usual weekend ritual. So if they're used to going to a 7:30 in the morning Mass, and with a changed Mass schedule, they now have to travel a mile or two, that's what they're going to do. Because their ritual is to go to Mass and go to brunch and then go home, have coffee, read the Sunday New York Times. Okay? And so they're going to go based on Mass time. And 1/3 are floaters. Depends what's happening that weekend. Okay? And there's no way you can really predict in advance how a Mass schedule is going to impact attendance. And so any change in Mass schedule, I always recommend put it in place for 6 months and evaluate it. For 2 reasons. One, because you can't tell, but the second thing is that for the most part, everyone's fears are rarely realized. And after 6 months, it's pretty rare that the schedule doesn't get changed. That people adjust, adapt. Again, as I joked this morning, they find out that God does show up at St. Leonard's. I hope there's no St. Leonard's in here. But what else was I going to say about Mass schedules? Okay, so again, there is going to be, but people knowing, that's what I was going to say, that there is going to be an opportunity to evaluate it makes them more able to say, okay, I'll try it. And if you just said, no, this is it, then their likelihood of resistance and negative energy goes up significant. Organizational variables. This gets into all kinds of fun stuff. And this is another one of your handouts, right? Okay, so this gets into linkages. This goes into more detail. And I'm going to plow through this fairly quickly. Tan colored. And some of this I've already referred to, but I want to drill into just a little bit more. One is the question of site-specific leadership. But here, in terms of the pastor and his leadership, there's a variety of leadership styles within the presbytery. You know it, you've experienced it. So in the first model, the pastor is clearly in charge and the leader. Okay? And that's clear to everybody, and that model can work. The research from the Emerging Models projects tells us that it isn't as effective as a pastor who's able to delegate and work with a staff who's willing to empower the whole community in service. But pastor's clearly in charge, okay, of each faith community. 2 is some responsibilities are delegated. Now, what are we talking about here? Let's take finance council. Most diocesan policies say the pastor has to be present at the finance council meeting. In our diocese, what we say is the pastor has to approve any significant action of the finance council, but he can send a well-trained, formed business manager to be his eyes and ears and present. Now, when you get into significant moments of the year, approving a budget, he's there. But he doesn't have to go to every meeting. Okay? So that, many pastors say, why didn't we do this years ago? Yeah. And others, because it is their gift, they like that. They want to be part of those discussions. But it's where you set up the boundaries and the expectations of what's delegated, what's within the span of influence, where they can make some decisions. If there's any question by the business manager, He needs to play his, I think this is a great idea. Before we move on it, I need to talk with the pastor, just to make sure. And if there's any reservation, that's okay. That's the pastor's role, responsibility. C is as much responsibility as delegated as possible. I told you the story this morning of the priest from India who was a missionary who ran 20 parishes. The only way he ran it was that he delegated just about everything and had, and this is the key, people who are well trained, informed, and competent. You know, it drives me wild when we have a policy in our diocese where we have, if you have two priests, two different parishes, and we're going to link them, which means that the pastor's going to drop, one pastor's going to drop out of the equation. Our policy says this is not a time to celebrate because now you can eliminate a salary and cut the budget. We say, no, you must invest that money in ideally a qualified, well-trained staff, layperson, deacon, whatever, to assist the pastor in serving these communities. Now, in some instances, it's a business manager they hire. In some instances, pastor loves the administration. There aren't a lot. There are some. Okay? And so he says, but I'm lousy at pastoral care. So I want to hire a pastoral associate, you know, who's going to help with adult formation and baptism prep and marriage prep and all the other kinds of, and coordinate lectors. And so there's a variety of ways to look at this, but as much as possible is delegated. But you get what you pay for. I was working with a parish a few years ago, and they didn't like the job that their business manager was doing. Nice guy, just not overly competent or skilled, but really a nice guy. And so they decided, or recommended to the pastor, they said, well, the business manager, he's really a nice guy. He likes to chat with people, etc. How about if we make him the pastoral associate and hire someone with business skills? Well, that's crazy. You know, they need the theological pastoral formation and training. I've also got parishes where I say, you know, the policy is, who did you hire? Well, we hired Sally. Well, what is Sally's training and background? Well, she was a stay-at-home mom and she's really sweet. And, not said, cheap. Because her husband has a real job. Tell me you haven't heard these stories. Okay? And the pastor is burning out because he's trying to run two parishes the way he ran one. And I said, well, what are you delegating to Sally? And the response is, well, I can't delegate anything to her. She doesn't know exactly what she's doing. Why didn't you listen to me? Okay? So, site-specific. The Elliptical Parish or Cohort organizational model. This comes from Chuck Zeck, who many of you are familiar with. You know, you have the pastor who holds the essential reins. Obviously, the leader of worship, faith formation, leads pastoral care, but then has a pastoral associate who's part of the team and a business manager. And you split those functions. So the pastoral associate helps with sacramental pulp, adult ed, visiting the sick homebound, coordinating liturgical ministers, social concerns. Again, that's a big job description. And maybe that's two people, and depending on the size of parish and how many cohorts and parishes you have working together. Business manager takes care of finances, buildings and grounds, communication, data reports, and support staff. Again, pastor, where's that little thing? Okay, this is his core team. You know, meets with regularly, you know, and makes sure that he's monitoring and supporting, but now has much more time, energy to focus on the spiritual worship, to hopefully not burn out. You know, in my 42 years, there have been 1 or 2 times that I've gotten pretty close to burnout, I have to admit. And as my wife, as only wives can say, would turn to me and she would say, you know, no one's going to listen to a crabby, burnt-out martyr. I think we need some people to help do that with some of our pastors. Enough said. Moving on. Yes?
Going back, we had the pleasure to be with Brother Lachlan Schofield last week. Many of you know from his work in collaboration. He talked about burnout being the result not of too much to do, but of unreasonable expectations. And I think that's what I'm hearing when you're saying
Yes.
that if we expect that a pastor's going to do all of that, it's a recipe for disaster. It's an unreasonable expectation. So that's where burnout comes from. It's not from the list of tasks, but that we have unreasonable expectations about who's needed to do that list of tasks.
I just have a question. I've not had any personal experience with it, but do any of your parishes use the model of the sacramental pastor and the parish
Yes.
life coordinator?
Parish life coordinator. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Canon Law 517.2, and where the pastoral care is delegated by the bishop to a deacon, layperson, or religious. And basically they handle most of these functions except for the sacramental ministry. And it is a model that can work. It was part of, the possibilities for in the diocese, but for a variety of reasons at this time it hasn't been implemented. Is that okay?
Another question with regard to that.
Yeah.
I've heard that the laity in the parish aren't ready for that. And I disagree with that, but just your thoughts. Is it true that, to place a parish life administrator, the laity aren't prepared for it, or is it the church, the church structure that isn't really prepared for it?
The honest answer is both. Because in parishes where we do appoint or do have parish life coordinators, we spend a good amount of time with the laity talking about it. Now, we're kind of unique because in Green Bay we have the most in the United States. When you look at number of parishes and number of parish life coordinators. But I don't think there's one of those parishes, even though they have a good parish life coordinator, who in their heart of hearts still don't long for there to be a priest again as pastor someday. And many of our parish life coordinators, they have a tough time for the first 18 months until they, quote, prove themselves. So it isn't, there are pros and cons and good reasons for not going into that model. And actually across the country, there are fewer of them over the last 10 years than there were 10 years ago because of the pros and cons. What tends to happen now in our country, especially in the Northeast and Midwest, is the influx of international priests. So that's how many diocese bishops are trying to meet the sacramental and pastoral leadership needs. That's another whole workshop, and later I'll be happy to go into it in more detail. Church in America. It's interesting to me that St. John Paul, back in 1999, Document Ecclesia in America, said a renewed parish needs the collaboration of lay people and therefore a director of pastoral activity and a pastor. Interesting model that St. John Paul proposed 18 years ago. Across the country, I haven't found this embraced. Okay, and some of it are the dynamics that we were just talking about with pastoral leaders, but I think we have several of our parishes that the pastors have done an excellent job of teaming with someone who has, especially in the management areas, the skills, the gifts to work together. They hold on to their trump card, and it's important that they do so.
I was just going to say that a team pastoral leadership model. I wonder if that language is being used at all in your work.
I think team is being used, but usually it's more than a two-person team.
Correct.
Okay, so core team is real common in parish. But team of two, it's kind of like when I work with pastoral councils. Pope Benedict said that pastoral councils need to be co-responsible for the mission of the church. That's pretty radical stuff. But that's a direct quote, co-responsible. Now, when I work with parish councils, I like to ask the question, most of us know what a board of directors is, and they set the policy, hire, fire, and the CEO carries it out. On the other end, you have an advisory group, where they offer advice to the chief executive officer, and, he can take or reject it. So the question is, where is the power in the parish? Anyone want to try to answer that? Yeah, it's a trick question. Because I hope the power's in the Holy Spirit. Okay? And the ability to discern that. And I think the best model is that pastoral councils are neither one of those extremes. When they do their best work, it's a partnership between the laity with their many gifts, talents, history, and the formation training of the pastor. Now, it's not a partnership of equals, and we need to be straightforward and honest about that. The pastor still has the trump card. And we do a disservice when we, give pastoral councils the impression that they are totally empowered. So it is a partnership, but ideally, the best pastors don't play that trump card any more than necessary. Okay? Let's roll on. Organization of staff. This is what we were just talking about. Work at one side, mixed to different, separate, except for the pastor, pastoral life coordinator, are site specific. Leadership formation. The ideal, again, this is that issue we chatted about earlier. Get the most qualified, trained, formed people, and when you can't, get them the training and formation they need. Allow time for pastors to mentor people. Part-time paid, training formation experience varies versus the trained volunteers. We have a lot of small-town rural parishes that don't have the fiscal resources for full staff, but get them the training. Most dioceses, your own diocese has a great television network and set of resources and workshops. Get people to them, so that they can get the gifts and training they need to be effective. Councils, again, we talked about site-specific versus each having its own. We know that 1/3 of multiple parishes share a council, so that's a growing phenomena, how that looks like. The community identity. Focus on one. Is there that desire to create one, where everything is at one spot? Or is there a balance between one and affirming the unique gifts of the separate? Great example on the west side of Green Bay. We have a pastor with 4 parishes. They're all within about 1.5 miles of each other. Parish A, the school is where the faith formation program goes. Parish B is a young adult drop-in youth center. Parish C is the outreach food pantry, outreach to the poor, the hurting, and needy. And Parish D has a Catholic school. Together, they serve the west side of Green Bay. It's a wonderful model. Each parish has its unique gift that together they support and go back and forth on. C is the very distinct communities cooperate on a few things, if any. And that's where some of the clusters probably, or cohorts are. Worship site identity. One is the mother church. Okay? It's usually the biggest. This is where confirmation, the Triduum, some of the, just out of necessity. Now again, C or B is there's a favorite, but not everything happens there. And if there's some comparable size, then you take turns. So the Triduum is in Parish A this year. Next year it's going to be in B. Or some will do Holy Thursday in one site, Good Friday in another, Holy Saturday still in a third. And last is each fairly equal in use. Ministries and programs all at one, shared, site-specific. This we do with our faith formation programs. So we may have the K or K to 5 religious ed program, one building, middle school another, high school in another. So everybody has something. Implementation, if you can maintain as much as possible, especially early on, while you're building that trust, try and do so. Hire help, check in, get feedback, find out what we're doing. So, I've quickly gone through change strategies. The last session we're going to do after a break is some very practical drilling into specific ministries that parishes have learned how to share.